A 14-year-old girl was about to be sold for a pair of boots until a loner rancher spoke her name. The dust hung thick in the air of Millbrook's Main Street, kicked up by the restless hooves of horses tied outside Murphy's saloon. It was the kind of day when decent fess stayed indoors, when the heat made tempers short and good judgment scarce. Jacob Whitmore had ridden into town with no intention of staying long, just needed supplies and would be gone before the sun kissed the horizon. He'd been a loner for the better part of 15 years, ever since Sarah died and took their unborn child with her. His ranch sat 20 miles north of Millbrook, a modest spread where he raised cattle and kept to himself. The townspeople knew him as fair but distant, a man who paid his debts and expected others to do the same. He had no use for the petty dramas that seemed to flourish in settlements like weeds after rain. Jacob had just finished loading flour and coffee into his wagon when he heard the commotion from the saloon, raised voices, the scrape of chairs, and something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the whimper of a child in distress. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking toward the batwing doors. Through the grimy windows he could see a crowd gathered around one of the poker tables. At its center stood Bear Hutchinson, a mountain of a man known for his cruelty and his death. Hutchinson was gesticulating wildly, his face red with drink and desperation. "I'm telling you, she's worth more than them boots," Hutchinson was saying. "Hell, she can cook, clean, and she's got good years left in her." Jacob pushed through the doors and saw what had drawn the crowd. Huddled behind Hutchinson was a slip of a girl, maybe 14, with tangled auburn hair and eyes the color of summer grass. Her dress was little more than rags, and purple bruises bloomed along her bare arms like grotesque flowers. But it was the resignation in her eyes that struck Jacob like a physical blow, the look of someone who had given up hope long ago. Across from Hutchinson sat Caleb Morrison, a trader who dealt in things better left unmentioned. Morrison's boots were indeed fine, polished leather with silver buckles that caught the lamplight. But Jacob could see the hunger in the man's eyes as he looked at the girl, and it made his stomach turn. "Come now, Bear," Morrison was saying, his voice oily with false concern. "The girl's half-starved and probably sick. Those boots cost me $40 in Denver. Seems like I'm the one taking the risk here." Hutchinson's hand fell to the girl's shoulder, and she flinched. "She's my daughter, ain't she? I can do what I want with her. And I want them boots. My feet are near frozen through these holes." He lifted one leg to show a boot that was more whole than leather. Jacob's jaw tightened. He knew Hutchinson by reputation, a drunk and a gambler who'd lost his farm the previous winter. The man's wife had died years ago, leaving him with 2 children. The boy had run off east, smart enough to know when to cut his losses. But the girl... "What's her name?" Jacob heard himself asking. The crowd turned, surprised by the interruption. Hutchinson squinted at him through bloodshot eyes. "What's it to you, Whitmore?" I asked what her name was. Hutchinson wavered on his feet. "Her name? Hell, what does that matter? Name don't change the deal. It matters to me." Jacob's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "What's your name, child?" The girl looked up at him with those green eyes, and for a moment Jacob saw not resignation but a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe, or just curiosity about this stranger who cared enough to ask. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the saloon's noise. "Emma Hutchinson." "Emma." Jacob repeated the name, and somehow speaking it aloud changed everything. She wasn't just a commodity being bartered away. She was Emma, a 14-year-old girl who deserved better than to be traded for a pair of boots. "That's a pretty name." A flush crept up Emma's neck, and Jacob realized it might have been the first kind word she'd heard in a long time. Morrison was growing impatient. "Look here, we've got business to conduct. Either Bear takes the deal, or... what if I made a counter-offer?" Jacob interrupted. The saloon fell silent except for the tick of the old clock above the bar. Hutchinson's eyes narrowed with new interest. "What kind of offer?" Jacob reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he set it on the table. $50, cash. Morrison leaned forward. $50 for what? For the girl. Jacob's words hung in the air like gun smoke. I'll pay Bear $50 for Emma, and you can keep your boots. Bear's eyes went wide. $50 was more money than he'd seen in months, but Morrison looked less pleased. He'd clearly had other plans for Emma. Now wait just a minute, Morrison protested. We had a deal. No, Jacob said firmly. You had a negotiation. I'm making an offer. He looked directly at Bear. $50 is more than those boots are worth, and we both know it. Bear was already reaching for the pouch, but Jacob pulled it back. On one condition, Emma comes with me willingly. She has a choice in this. She's my daughter. Bear sputtered. She don't get no choice. She does now. Jacob turned to Emma, whose eyes had gone wide with disbelief. Emma, I've got a ranch north of here. It's not much. Just me and the cattle and an old dog named Jasper, but there's a spare room, plenty of food, and nobody will ever hurt you there. If you want to come, you're welcome. If you don't, I'll walk away right now and you can make your own decision about what happens next. Emma stared at him for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Then her gaze shifted to Morrison, whose face had darkened with anger. Then back to her father, who was looking at the money pouch like a man dying of thirst looks at water. You'd really take me away from here? She asked. If that's what you want. She nodded slowly, then with growing certainty. Yes, I want to go with you. Jacob placed the pouch on the table. It's done then. Bear snatched the money. So quickly it seemed to disappear into his grimy hands. Pleasure doing business, he said, not even looking at Emma. You got yourself a good worker there, Whitmore. Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This ain't over, he growled, though it was unclear whether he was addressing Jacob or Bear. Yes, it is, Jacob said quietly. He turned to Emma. You got anything you need to collect? Emma shook her head. I don't have nothing. Then let's go. As they walked toward the door, the crowd parted before them. Jacob could feel their stares, hear the whispered conversations already beginning. By tomorrow, the story would be all over town, probably embellished beyond recognition. He didn't care. Outside, Emma blinked in the harsh sunlight like someone emerging from a cave. Jacob helped her up onto the wagon seat, noting how light she was, how her bones seemed to poke through her thin dress. You hungry? He asked, as they rolled out of town. Emma nodded, but said nothing. Jacob reached behind the seat and pulled out a cloth bundle. Mary Patterson at the general store always packs extra biscuits. She says a man can't live on coffee alone, though I've been trying to prove her wrong for years. Emma accepted the biscuit with careful hands, as if afraid it might disappear. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. As they rode through the rolling hills toward Jacob's ranch, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger. She sat ramrod straight, alert to every sound and movement, like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. You been working for your father long? He asked, more to break the silence than from curiosity. Since Ma died. That was 4 years ago, I think. Maybe 5. Emma's voice was still quiet, but steadier now. Pa used to be different. Before Ma got sick and the farm started failing, she trailed off, as if speaking good memories of her father might somehow jinx them. Jacob nodded. He'd seen what desperation could do to a man, how it could chip away at decency until nothing was left but hunger and need. What happened to your brother? Tommy. He left right after we lost the farm, said he was going to California, going to strike it rich and come back for me. Emma's voice grew smaller. That was 8 months ago. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mr. Whitmore, Emma said finally. Jacob. Just Jacob. Jacob, why did you Why did you help me back there? You don't even know me. It was a fair question, and one Jacob wasn't sure he could answer completely. How could he explain that hearing her name had somehow made her real to him in a way that the nameless, faceless victims of the world never were? How could he tell her that in her green eyes he'd seen an echo of his own losses, his own understanding of what it meant to be powerless in the face of circumstances beyond your control? I reckon everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path, he said finally. You weren't getting that chance. Emma considered this. What if I can't work hard enough? What if I'm not worth $50? Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to look at her directly. Emma, let me make something clear. You don't owe me $50 worth of work. You don't owe me anything. That money wasn't a purchase. It was the price of your freedom. What you do with that freedom is up to you. For the first time since he'd met her, Emma smiled. It was a small, tentative thing, like the first green shoots after a long winter. But it transformed her entire face. I ain't never had much freedom before, she admitted. Well, Jacob said, snapping the reins to get the horses moving again. I reckon it's about time you learned what to do with it. The ranch came into view as the last light faded from the sky. It wasn't much to look at. A modest house, a barn, a handful of outbuildings, and endless acres of grassland dotted with cattle. But it was peaceful in a way that town never was, with only the sound of wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cows. Jasper, an old border collie with one gray ear, came trotting out to greet them. He sniffed curiously at Emma, then seemed to approve, offering her his head to pet. Jasper's a good judge of character, Jacob said as he helped Emma down from the wagon. If he likes you, you're all right by me. Inside, the house was clean but spare. The main room held a stone fireplace, a simple wooden table, and 2 chairs. Through an open doorway, Emma could see a kitchen with a wood-burning stove and shelves lined with canned goods. There's a room upstairs, Jacob said. It was meant to be a nursery once, but it's got a good bed and a window that faces east. You'll get the morning sun. Emma nodded, following him up the narrow stairs. The room was small but bright, with whitewashed walls and a quilt-covered bed. A washstand sat in one corner, and someone had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill. I picked those this morning, Jacob said, a little embarrassed. Thought the room could use some color. Emma touched one of the flower petals gently. They're beautiful. Thank you. There's water in the pitcher for washing, and I'll bring up some clean clothes. They might be a bit big. They belonged to... He stopped himself. Well, they'll do until we can get you something proper. After Jacob left, Emma stood alone in the little room, scarcely able to believe her change in circumstances. This morning she'd awakened on a pile of hay in the back of Murphy's saloon, where her father had been sleeping off another drunk. By noon she'd been facing the prospect of being sold to Morrison, and now as the stars began to appear outside her window, she was standing in a clean room with a real bed and wildflowers. She touched the quilt, marveling at its softness. When was the last time she'd slept on something other than the ground or a pile of rags? She couldn't remember. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Jacob's voice came through the door. I'm leaving some clothes outside, and there's soap and towels. Take all the time you need. Emma waited until she heard his footsteps retreat down the stairs, then opened the door. True to his word, there was a neat pile of clothes. A blue dress with tiny white flowers, undergarments that looked barely worn, and a warm shawl. Everything was clean and smelled of lavender. For the first time in months, Emma allowed herself a real bath, scrubbing away layers of dirt and shame until her skin was pink and clean. The dress was indeed too big, but it was the finest thing she'd worn since her mother died. She brushed her hair until it gleamed like burnished copper in the lamplight. When she finally ventured downstairs, she found Jacob at the stove, stirring something that smelled heavenly. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of the young woman she was beneath the grime and fear. You look better, he said simply. The stew was the best thing Emma had ever tasted. Thick, with beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. She ate 2 bowls while Jacob watched, saying nothing but refilling her bowl each time it emptied. "The dress was Sarah's," he said finally. "My wife. She died 5 years ago. I thought she'd want her things to be useful again." Emma looked down at the blue fabric. "I'm sorry. About your wife." Jacob nodded. "She would have liked. She always said a person's worth wasn't measured by what they had, but by what they did when they had nothing left to lose." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling in the grate. Finally Jacob spoke again. "Emma, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity, and it's not because I feel sorry for you. I offered you a home because I believe everyone deserves one. But this is your home now for as long as you want it. You're not a guest, and you're not a servant. You're, well, I suppose you're family." Emma's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. For the first time in years, she felt safe. For the first time in her life, she felt valued for something other than her usefulness. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Jacob said quietly. "Thank you. This house has been too quiet for too long." Over the following weeks, Emma settled into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She insisted on helping with the cooking and cleaning, not out of obligation but from a genuine desire to contribute. She had a natural way with the animals, and Jasper rarely left her side. Jacob found himself looking forward to meals, to the sound of Emma's voice reading aloud from the books Sarah had loved, to the way she hummed while she worked. The house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Sarah died. But not everyone was pleased with the arrangement. On a cold Thursday morning 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, Sheriff Tom Bradley rode up to the ranch with a grim expression. "Morning, Jacob," he said, dismounting heavily. "I need to talk to you about the girl." Jacob's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle mounted by the door. "What about her? Bear Hutchinson's been making noise in town. Says you stole his daughter. Says the transaction wasn't legal. And Morrison." Bradley shook his head. "Morrison's got friends, Jacob. Influential friends. They're putting pressure on me to bring the girl back." "She's not going back," Jacob said flatly. "Now Jacob." "Tom, you've known me for 10 years. Have I ever lied to you?" Bradley considered this. "No, you haven't." "Then believe me when I tell you that taking Emma back to that situation would be signing her death warrant. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." From the doorway came a small voice. "Sheriff Brad." Both men turned to see Emma standing there, no longer the cowering waif from the saloon, but a young woman with clear eyes and straight shoulders. "Yes, miss? I heard what you said about Mr. Morrison's friends. I want you to know that I came here by choice. Whitmore gave me that choice when nobody else would." She paused, gathering courage. "If you take me back, I'll just run away again. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to find someone like Jacob." Bradley looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not that simple, miss. Your father has legal rights. My father sold me for a pair of boots," Emma said quietly. "When a man sells his daughter, doesn't he give up his rights as a father?" The sheriff had no answer for that. He shifted his weight, looking out at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. "There's going to be trouble, Jacob. Morrison's not the type to let this go." "Then we'll face it when it comes," Jacob replied. "But Emma stays here." Bradley nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can to buy you time, but watch your back." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emma was quieter than usual. Finally she spoke. "Jacob, maybe I should go. I don't want to bring trouble on you." Jacob set down the leather he'd been mending and looked at her serious. "Emma, do you remember what I told you about everyone deserving a chance to choose their own path?" She nodded. "Well, sometimes when you choose the right path, other people try to block your way. That doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means you're threatening something they want to protect. Morrison and men like him profit from other people's desperation. By refusing to be desperate, by choosing hope instead of resignation, you're dangerous to them." Emma considered this. "So what do we do?"
We live our lives, Jacob said simply. We take care of the cattle, we tend the garden, we read books by the fire. We don't let fear make our choices for us. But Jacob knew it wouldn't be that simple. That night he cleaned his rifle and checked the locks on all the doors and windows. He'd meant what he said about not letting fear rule them. But he wasn't fool enough to be unprepared. The attack came 2 nights later. Emma was awakened by Jasper's low growling and the sound of horses in the yard. She crept to her window and saw 3 figures moving stealthily toward the house. Moonlight glinted off something metallic in one man's hand. Moving as quietly as she could, Emma slipped downstairs. Jacob was already awake, standing by the front window with his rifle. "Morrison," she whispered, "and 2 others. They're trying to surround the house." Jacob's voice was calm, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. "What do they want?" "You, most likely." Morrison's probably convinced himself that if he can't have you legally, he'll take you illegally. A voice called out from the yard. "Witness, send the girl out, and nobody gets hurt." Jacob stepped to the door but didn't open it. "Emma's under my protection, Morrison. Best you turn around and head back to town. Your protection ain't worth much out here, old man. It's 3 against 1. 4 against 3, actually." Emma spun around to see Sheriff Bradley stepping out of the kitchen, his badge glinting in the lamplight. He'd obviously come in through the back door. "Tom," Jacob said, surprised. "Figured you might need some backup," Bradley said with a grin. "Besides, I never did like Morrison's attitude." Outside, Morrison's voice had changed, becoming uncertain. "Sheriff, what are you doing here?" "My job," Bradley called back, "which is keeping the peace, and right now you're disturbing it." There was a long silence, then the sound of retreating horses. Morrison wasn't brave enough to face down a sheriff, especially one who'd clearly chosen sides. "They'll be back," Bradley said after the hoofbeats faded. "Morrison's not the type to give up easy." Jacob nodded. "I know. But Emma's not going anywhere." The sheriff looked at the girl, who stood straight and unafraid despite the danger she'd just faced. "I can see why you'd fight for her, Jacob. She's got steel in her spine." Over the next few days, Jacob made some changes around the ranch. He hired 2 hands, young men from town, who'd been looking for honest work. He also sent word to some old friends, cowboys he'd worked with in his younger days. By the end of the week, the ranch had gone from a quiet retreat to a small fortress. But it was Emma who suggested the solution that finally ended Morrison's harassment. "What if we made it legal?" she said one evening as they planned watch schedules. "Made what legal?" Jacob asked. "Me being here. What if you adopted me? Then my father couldn't claim any rights, and Morrison would have no legal standing at all." Jacob stared at her. The idea had never occurred to him, but it made perfect sense. "Emma, adoption it's permanent. It would make you my daughter in the eyes of the law. Would that be so terrible?" Jacob felt something warm unfold in his chest. "No," he said softly, "it wouldn't be terrible at all." The adoption proceedings took 3 weeks. Judge Harrison, who'd known Sarah and had always respected Jacob, made the process as smooth as possible. When Bear Hutchinson was served with papers, he didn't even show up to contest them. He was too busy drinking away the $50 he'd been paid. Morrison made one last attempt to interfere, claiming Emma had been promised to him, but without Bear's support and with Sheriff Bradley firmly on Jacob's side, his protests fell on deaf ears. On a crisp autumn morning, Emma Hutchinson became Emma Whitmore. She signed the papers with careful, precise letters, having learned to write properly in the evenings by lamplight with Jacob's patient instruction. "How does it feel?" Jacob asked as they walked out of the courthouse. Emma smiled, the free, unguarded smile that had become more common as the weeks passed. "It feels like coming home." That winter was the happiest either of them could remember. Emma proved to have a natural talent for managing the ranch's books, and her suggestions for improving their cattle breeding operation showed a keen intelligence that impressed even the neighboring ranchers. Jacob taught her to ride properly, to shoot straight, and to read the weather like an old-timer. But more than that, they became a real family. They developed their own traditions: Sunday morning rides to check the fences, evening readings by the fire, elaborate Sunday dinners that sometimes included the sheriff and other friends from town. Emma bloomed under the security and affection, growing taller and filling out, her green eyes bright with confidence and humor. Watching her, Jacob often thought of Sarah and the child they'd lost. This wasn't the family he'd once dreamed of, but it was perhaps the one he'd needed. Spring brought news that Bear Hutchinson had died in a saloon fight 3 towns over. Emma received the news with sadness but not grief. She'd mourned the father he could have been long ago. Morrison had left town shortly after the adoption was finalized, heading west to territories where his particular brand of business might be more welcome. Sheriff Bradley made sure word of his activities followed him, ensuring he'd find no refuge in decent community. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Emma spoke thoughtfully. "Jacob, do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't come to town that day, or if you hadn't asked my name?" Jacob considered this. "I try not to dwell on might have beens, but I'll tell you this, I believe things happen for a reason. Sarah and I were meant to be parents, but not in the way we expected. You were meant to have a real family, but not the one you were born into. Sometimes life takes a while to get things right." Emma nodded, understanding. "I used to think my story was about being rescued, but I don't think that's right. I think it's about finding where I belonged all along."
As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jacob felt a deep sense of contentment. He'd gained more than just a daughter that day. In Murphy's saloon, he'd rediscovered his own capacity for hope, for connection, for the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return, but gives everything freely. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. Emma grew into a remarkable young woman, respected throughout the territory for her intelligence, her fairness and her unwavering moral compass. She never forgot where she'd come from, and she made it her mission to help others who found themselves in desperate circumstances. When she finally married to a young doctor who saw in her not just beauty but strength and wisdom, it was Jacob who walked her down the aisle. As he placed her hand in her husband's, he thought about that day years ago when a 14-year-old girl was about to be sold for a pair of boots. He'd asked her name, and in doing so had given her back her humanity. But Emma had given him something far more precious in return. She'd given him a future worth believing in. The story of Emma Whitmore became legend in those parts, told and retold until fact blended with folklore. But those who knew the truth understood that the real miracle wasn't in the rescue. It was in the recognition that every person, no matter how powerless they seem, has value that can't be measured in dollars or boots or any other currency. Sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or miraculous interventions, but from the simple act of one person seeing another's worth when the rest of the world has forgotten it exists. And sometimes, a single name spoken with compassion can change not just one life, but in the end, Jacob and Emma saved each other, proving that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice, courage, and the willingness to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Years later, when people asked Emma about her remarkable life, she would always return to that moment in the saloon, when a stranger asked her name. "That," she would say with a smile, "was when my real life began."